Welcome to the Americas 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. Americas 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
This is Americas 360, and I am your host, Leela Abed, filling in this episode for John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies. And Americas 360 is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Programs, and Mexico Institute. In this episode of Americas 360, we delve into the crucial transatlantic relations between Europe and the Americas. Spain assumed the presidency of the Council of the European Union this July, kicking off the country's 5th leadership term. The European Union remains the second largest foreign investor in Latin America and the Caribbean, with countries like the United States and China both pushing to increase their investments into the region. Against this backdrop, the European Union and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States hosted the 3rd EU Select Summit in Brussels this July 17th and 18th, highlighting discussions on health resilience, security, climate change, trade, and digital transformation. And here to analyze these topics, we have our roundtable of experts. Wilson Center's Distinguished Fellow, Cindy Arnson. Cindy, great to have you.
Hi, Leela.
Latin American Program Director, Benjamin Gadan. So good to see you.
Likewise, Leela.
Mexico Institute Program Director, Andrew Redmond. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Leela.
Brazil Institute Director, Bruna Santos. Bruna, welcome.
Hello, Leela. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, Canada's Institute Director, Chris Sands. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Leela. Nice to be here.
So Cindy, since you were the first on the list, let's kick this conversation off with you. I think it's evident, right? Europe's importance and influence in Latin America, especially when it comes to the economy. Annual trade between the two blocs has increased 39% over the past decade to 369 billion euros or $414 billion. EU investment in the region stood at 693 billion euros, a 45% increase over the past decade. So how would you assess the impact, Cindy, made by European investments in the Americas in the past decade, and which sectors really stand out to you?
Well, I think the figures that you've just cited speak for themselves. The European Union presence as a whole is massive in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the EU is looking to expand that. And I think one of the notable things at the EU CELAC summit that took place in Brussels in July was a pledge by the EU to invest another $50 billion in the region, in green economies, in access to raw materials that are important for the energy transition. But I think it's important to point out that unlike China, which has the commodities trade at the center of its economic relationship with Latin America, the EU has a much more diverse relationship that involves manufacturing investments in addition to primary commodities and energy.
Cindy, I think you bringing up China is very important. I think we're going to get to that in just a bit. But Benjamin, a key objective for Europe at this summit was really to seek greater support for Ukraine and counter the Russian invasion, reduce China's dependence in the region, as Cindy kind of alluded to. But there's also this affirmation, right, that a lot of the part of this organization has a commitment to democracy and human rights and fundamental freedoms. How do you see these issues playing out in the region with the EU's influence growing during this past decade?
So those who are interested in the defense of democracy in Latin America should welcome the EU as an external partner for the region. Obviously, that's not the foundation of the Chinese relationship with the countries in the Americas. And so, the EU should be really seen as a force multiplier for the United States and other allies of democracy in Latin America. That said, it's not an easy strategy at this point, right? Even for the EU to pursue. The EU was faced with the same challenge the United States faced when hosting the Summit of the Americas last year in Los Angeles, Angeles, which is, should you include the dictatorships in Latin America? And ultimately, the EU decided to do so. And the consequence of that, you could see in the final declaration that there wasn't such a robust response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nor in general the embrace of democracy that we would love to see from the Americas when we talk about these shared values with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. So at the end of the day, I think the EU is certainly a good influence on the Americas when it comes to democracy, but faces the same challenge the United States faces in the region.
So, Benjamin, you still see this division, right, in the region because of China's influence and the fact that it does capture the attention of some of the governments in the hemisphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the EU is really savvy in emphasizing its infrastructure investments in the region through this global gateway program, because fundamentally China's influence is based on the capital it puts in Latin America and on its voracious appetite for the exports
muted,
from Latin
Benjamin,
America.
You're
and
muted.
So it's nice to have conversations about shared values, but the influence that the EU or the United States might have in the Americas really will be based on the money put on the table. And so I think the EU, frankly, did much better than the United States in the Summit of the Americas by stepping forward and putting in this $50 billion that Cindy referenced, which will make a meaningful difference in the region and really turn heads.
I'm eager to get both Bruna's and Andrew's reaction, right, as they represent the two sort of giants in the region. And so in 2021, Brazil and Mexico were the two countries that received the most foreign direct investment. How important was the EU in terms of investing in key and strategic sectors in Brazil, Bruna?
Well, first of all, I think economically, the EU is Brazil's second largest trade partner. In terms of investments, is like really close to the US in importance. And I think the European Union today, as Benjamin mentioned, holds a pivotal role in Brazil's like strategic landscape, as it's seen by the current government not only as a beacon of Western democracy, but also as a component, an important component in this vision of a multipolar international framework, which is essential to counterbalance this the polarization between the binary between China and the US. So I think there is an extremely like important investment coming in now in Brazil, not only through the Amazon Fund, but also in the energy sector, I would highlight. As Benjamin mentioned, there were other sectors with a big size of investments being made, but also like I believe that green hydrogen is definitely a big highlight in the energy sector in Brazil. Some of the first endeavors in the country on green hydrogen has been made by German companies, and it was a highlight that came out of the Global Gateway agenda among the 130 projects that are supposed to be developed in the region. So I think the green economy, clean energy, with a highlight to green hydrogen is three important agendas for European investments in the region.
And I think that goes with trend with the ecological transition and this focus on renewable energies, right, that's coming from the European Union and kind of has translated into their policies and strategies with Latin America. Andrew, the European Union and Mexico recently just modernized their trade agreement, which has really helped both economies to stretch sort of their already good relationship in terms of trade and economics, but also other issues such as commitment to democracy and human rights. So how have you seen the relationship between Mexico and the EU? Has it been strengthened, or do you see that the United States still sort of is at the top of the line for Mexico in comparison to the EU?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, certainly the free trade agreement, and Mexico was the first country in Latin America to have a free trade agreement with the EU, and it makes sense, just as it made sense to update NAFTA for Mexico and the EU to update their agreement. And there's always been friction. Mexico sometimes plays the middle on standards that the U.S. wants to set versus what Europe wants to set on things like geographic indicators or different structures, different regulatory provisions. I think, while the EU is the number 2 trading partner, number 2 investor, the difference maybe between Mexico and Brazil or other countries in the hemisphere is that the U.S. is just so overwhelmingly dominant in terms of the importance of to the Mexican economy. So I think you see improvement, and certainly updating the agreement is a good sign, and there has been investment. nearshoring investment from European countries, just as from Chinese countries, as they look to get into the North American market, to get inside the USMCA.
Chris, now I might be completely wrong, but that's why I asked my Canada expert. According to my research, Canada is the oldest formal relationship the EU has with any industrialized country. And not only does Canada have strategic and economic agreements in place with the EU, but it also has contributed to European civilian and military missions in different regions around the world. I mean, it's a very, it's a wide range of issues that Canada seems to have with the European Union. So how would you categorize this bilateral relationship?
Well, it's a very interesting one, Leila. In some ways, when we started talking about this podcast theme, I thought, well, Canada's going to be the odd country out. Its relationships with Europe are very different. They're a NATO member. They're participating in a Western European transatlantic community in a very different way. And of course, just 4 years ago, Canada signed the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, which has labor mobility provisions. It has sort of professional certifications that are recognized on both sides. It provides for respect for certain geographic indicators. And in terms of trade, even allows for a certain amount of U.S. content in a Canadian good that can still enter into the European Union, which is a big sort of step forward, acknowledging the fact that the U.S. and Canada have integrated their supply chains so much. Now, you could say, well, that puts Canada in a different category. Why are they even here in this discussion on America's 360? But when I think about it, I also think Canada has set a benchmark there for what Latin American countries could aspire to or even demand from the Europeans as partners. When we talk about the EU-Latin America relationship, there is still a development component, and there is a little bit of we're a developed region and you're still developing kind of dynamic. But when you take that off the table, I think you can hope for a much more sophisticated relationship in which the U.S. is always sort of there in the background. It is a shadow on all of this, but one which the U.S. doesn't see as a negative competition, and which can bring the modern Latin American economy, the information economy, the energy economy Bruno was talking about, but apps, technology, cell phones, all of the things that we think of as the sort of modern economy, and a real meeting of peers. And I think that's, if there's anything from the Canadian experience that could be useful here in this discussion, it's that Latin America sets its sights high and demand equal treatment with the Canadian.
Cindy, your thoughts?
Sure. I just want to add another ingredient to this important conversation, which has to do precisely with energy and the needs of the European community and European Union after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to broad international sanctions from both Western Europe and the United States. Almost a quarter of the EU's overall energy imports in 2020 came from Russia, almost a quarter. And if you look just at natural gas, the figure is 50% of natural gas imported into the EU came from Russia. And this was a very deliberate strategy, I think, to try to improve the relationships between European countries, particularly Germany, by having these gas pipelines. So the need for energy is pretty acute in Europe, and Latin America is seen as not only a source of traditional oil and gas, but also as being in the forefront of this green energy transition, not only with lithium resources, but also the attempts to develop green hydrogen and other kinds of new technologies. And that points also to the importance in the final declaration of Ukraine as an issue of central importance to the EU. But I'll stop there and let one of my other colleagues talk some more about that.
Well, Cindy and Benjamin, if you want to chime in here as well. I find it very interesting, this news about the fact that the grain that was supposed to flow from Ukraine to countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where hunger is a growing threat, has been halted, right? With Russia saying it's no longer going to allow grain to leave Ukrainian ports. Does this offer Latin America sort of an opportunity to fill those voids, or is it really going to not be able to really do much about this aspect of what's happening in Ukraine? I feel that what you just mentioned, Cindy, in terms of energy and in terms of how that can play a role in Latin America, this, this ability to produce grain and fertilizers, I know Bruna and Brazil are very important. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I think frankly there's a relatively low ceiling on what the EU is willing to do in the Americas. The reality is that what happens in the Americas just doesn't impact Europe in the way it does the United States. And, migration is the most obvious example of that. But, you can think of economic links and kind of go down the list. But Cindy's absolutely right. The impacts of the war in Ukraine have reminded Europe that the partnership with the Americas is valuable, right? It isn't just a place where Europe is being asked to defend democracy or address the crisis in Haiti or the Venezuelan migration nightmare, but it's also a place with these enormous quantities of critical minerals, a lot of potential for renewable energy. It is a place that can be helpful to Europe if the right partnerships are built. And so I think it's an opportunity for Latin America. It's an immense diplomatic and economic and geostrategic opportunity to be a valuable partner on food security and energy security above all.
And on this line of food and energy security, Bruna, how do you see this playing out in Brazil with EU's presence there?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Benjamin. But I also like the European markets are open to Brazilian critical minerals now. So that's a more obvious partner too. Also, I totally agree with Cindy when she says that the significance of Latin America has grown among Europeans due not only to the escalating climate crisis, but also Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. But in Brazil, I think that Lula's election was also an important element to it. We all remember the bad relationship between Brazil's former president and the French president and the German. So I think that we need, right now, I think the region is abundant in essential raw materials towards like this low carbon economy, of course. But I want to mention something that is where, in my opinion, the European Union is very influential in the country, which is what we call the Brussels effect, the digital market regulatory aspects of it, and how it's being like more and more influential in all this like climate change and environmental agenda, also in the regulatory aspects of it. So I think that when it comes to looking at the Brussels effect to the digital economy, data protection, internet regulation, now AI, I think is where this effect is more evident. And I don't want to dive into that so much, but I think that the general data protection regulation created in the European Union was definitely an inspiration for Brazil and for a number of Latin American countries. I ask myself, if it is the most adequate model for the Latin American countries, an example of Brazil and the size of the market. But the Columbia law professor who coined the term Brussels effect, she says something in her book that it's important to remember. She says that the EU law determined the timber that is harvested in Indonesia and how honey is going to be produced in Brazil. So I think that through this regulatory mimetism, somehow the European Union is gauging more and more influence in the region, and especially in Brazil when it comes to important supply chains.
And shifting gears a little bit here, Andrew, what is your take on the declaration of the EU Select Summit 2023? Are there any specific articles within that document that kind of stand out to you?
Thanks, Leela. There's one that I thought was sort of surprising, but I think maybe connects to topics we've talked about before, and that's it kind of in the middle in Article 36, as we acknowledge the need to better and proactively inform our citizens and relevant stakeholders about mutual benefits of the CELAC EU partnership. And that, that jumps out at me, and maybe this is too much of a reach, but that maybe in some sense, this is the government's acknowledging that they have to convince their people that democracy has value and that these relationships matter, because otherwise, I think it just plays into that idea of that none of this is having an impact on people's lives, and that's what leads to more support for populism. So I thought it was kind of interesting, sort of slipped in there. I didn't notice it the first time I skimmed through. But it's just something I thought curious, and I'll just say, going back to what Bruna was saying, that was what she just mentioned is sort of what I was talking about earlier, this idea that the EU competes to get different countries to accept its standards, as do we. And that's really played out heavily in Mexico as it tries to negotiate FTAs, or it has negotiated FTAs with the US that wants certain standards for intellectual property, and the EU, which has different approaches.
Chris, we're wrapping up here, but before we do close this conversation, I wanted to ask you how you see culture playing a role, right, in the EU-Canada relationship, and perhaps even in North America and Latin America more broadly.
I think in a way, this builds on something that Andrew just raised. We're all looking at relationships that are negotiated by governments and governmental elites at some level, but sometimes it's the people-to-people ties, the resonances that make it make sense for us to have these conversations. I'm brought to mind that when Britain Brexited out of the European Union, there was a fairly significant effort on the part of Ottawa to negotiate with the British a bridge agreement to give Britain the same CETA level of access to Canada's market that they had before Brexit. And they were very proactive, and it turned out to be quite popular with Canadians generally. It felt like a right and fair thing to do to what was once their colonial power. And because of the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, the Organization of La Francophonie, former French colonies, which Canada participates in, Canada has often been a partner with Britain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, across the Caribbean, and with the EU generally, trying to help those countries access bigger and bigger markets, because as island economies, they have small internal ones. So, sometimes these cultural ties resonate. And I know that there's been Ibero-American dialogues, both for the Portuguese component or the Spanish component, but even in the English and French parts of the Americas, those ties to Europe, they do still resonate.
Very interesting and very true as well. Cindy, I know that you wanted to talk about Mercosur for a second. We do have about 2 minutes left, so if you can, it'd be great.
Sure. Well, one of the striking things to me was that, we don't know what went on in the private conversations between President Lula and leaders of the European delegation, but one thing that has just been stuck for years is an approval of a free trade agreement between the EU and the Mercosur countries of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And a lot of this, as Bruno was alluding to, was stuck because of the environmental policies, or more importantly, the lack thereof under the previous administration of Jair Bolsonaro. But now the EU has added a commitment that it wants signed about deforestation, and Lula has condemned this as a form of neocolonialism or whatever. And one has to wonder, how much of this emphasis on deforestation, which we all agree is a crucial issue, is a smokescreen for a certain kind of protectionism in key European countries that have important agricultural sectors and that really don't want to open up to exports of beef from Brazil and Argentina to the EU. So there was a statement by Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, that she hopes or thinks that there will be a signing of this agreement before the end of the year. I am certainly not going to hold my breath.
Unfortunately, we will need to leave it there. Andrew, Cindy, Bruna, Benjamin, Chris, thank you for your insight, and thank you for the opportunity to host today's episode. We look forward to learning more from you in future episodes. This episode of Americas 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz, Xavi Delgado, and Aldrich Ballesteros with the assistance of Isabel Steiner. Until then, from all of us at the Wilson Center and Americas 360, I'm Leila Abed, and thank you for joining us today.
You have been listening to Americas 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of Americas 360.